I just want to sort of preface this by saying that in the course of working on post-millennial fiction, particularly in the past few years, I wondered whether our new century demands a fresh set of critical vocabularies for describing what's distinctive about the literature that arises from it. To put it simply, what does it mean for a certain time to provoke or require certain kinds of critical languages? More specifically, I've been interested in a couple of questions. Well, firstly, why a significant cluster of writers, 21st century writers, have articulated what we might call a kind of politics of location, though not as you expect by going global, but actually by reverting to or refocusing on the local. And secondly, how might these writers help us to develop a more robust critical lexicon, if you like, for considering the figuration of racial identity and community and belonging, not just at the level of thematics or national allegory, where such issues are usually explored, but also in relation to form itself. When novelist Philip Hensher recently suggested that, quote, fiction asks us to examine the scale of our own compassion and interest, he captured the essence of what is both a dilemma and point of departure for contemporary literature's cosmopolitan imagination. At once perspectival and capacious, regional and unruly, narrative fiction seems well suited to engage with this question of how to render worldly experiences of racial disenfranchisement or cultural displacement while expanding its readers' affective scale of compassion. Yet among a certain generation of post-millennial writers, this process of rescaling has been as much about mode as about the reader's edification. Calibrating the personal, familial, and social dynamics of identity, these figures have reworked the kind of fiction whose geographical and characterological coordinates seem deliberately compressed, whose diegetic reach might seem confined, contingent upon quotidian circumstances, and whose vision may appear to be contracted, if not provincialized, fiction that is of local life. Such a contraction in scale and focus might seem like a point of departure from the famous epics that define the postmodernism of the 1980s and 90s. But far from leaving postmodernism behind altogether, the kind of recent localist fiction I have in mind participates in that dialogical relation that Ramon Saldivar has called between postmodern aesthetics and the practice of a broad cohort of contemporary minority writers. Now, Zadie in his article which is an article in Narrative on race and form, he concentrates on Colson Whitehead, but one could also consider among this group Monica Ali's Brick Lane, Teju Cole's Open City, Junot Diaz's latest collection of short stories, This Is How You Lose Her, probably Dave Eggers' Hologram for a King, Mohsin Hamed's How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia, people like that, David Grossman's To the End of the Land, and Jhumpa Lahiri and Zadie Smith, both of whom I'll be focusing on here. Now, while such writers converse with the legacies of postmodernism in chronically new social imaginaries, they've nonetheless moved away from the signature techniques of postmodernist fiction in ways that suggest formal alternatives are already being sought and tested. Identifying among these emergent responses a post-race aesthetic in 21st century fiction, Ramon Saldivar argues that minority writers, with few exceptions, have found postmodernism an inhospitable domain for their representations of contemporary social conditions. Why the domain Lahiri and Smith find genial is at the same time more regional will be the question I pursue here. They seem to be responding to the same question up there. But although they contrast each other in register, geography and form, Lahiri and Smith find common ground in addressing profound questions of racial difference, cultural displacement and assimilation through narrative actions confined to specific domestic spheres or urban precincts. These preoccupations can be seen as a part of a broader paradigm shift. For whereas Pynchon and DeLillo, as David Marcus puts it, emphasise the unseen networks of government agents and advertising executives that limited our everyday lives, the new group, which according to Marcus includes David Foster Wallace, Dave Eggers, Smith herself, have tried to map out more local, more empowering connections to mine the present for those rare, fragile moments of contact. Now, as we shall see, this localist aesthetic by no means turns away from the interracial dynamics of cultural conviviality or from the ethically unpredictable demands of cosmopolitan accommodation. On the contrary, Lahiri and Smith dramatise the tension between the local and the global in imagining forms of social being, a tension that, as Dominic Head has pointed out, has been captured by the opposed perspectives on cosmopolitanism itself, even as critics try to retain that term and the potential of the concept in the historical moment of globalisation. More significantly, these productive frictions and dialogues arising between the interaction between national and transnational impulses signal parallels between creative and critical discourse, as the fraught global-local dialectic in theory also pinpoints the current crossroads of the novel in practice. Lahiri and Smith each operate at these crossroads, which denote, of course, too, the crossroads of form. Yet the issue of what forms are most appropriate to evoking aspects of social and racial disenfranchisement or to representing the evolving agendas of minority groups is by no means clear-cut. On the one hand, preconceptions about the self-absorbed ventures of postmodern experimentalism can reinforce the assumption that fiction born of self-referential invention is hard-pressed to gain purchase on the material actualities of discrimination and marginalisation. On the other hand, social realism these days offers no easy solutions either, especially when we see that post-colonial studies, as Susan Andrade has recently argued, has a history of anxiety about having to defend its literature from being treated as ethnography. As a predicate for this defence, it's modernism, which is often perceived to be better suited to realism, to elucidating the complexities and relations of power under colonialism, and therefore it also articulates the challenges of the post-colonial condition. These formal alternatives for the novel, shot through by competing critical sympathies about the kinds of political valencies we associate with different narrative modes, are complicated still further in our time as writers process the artistic reverberations of postmodernism. Over the past decade or so, emerging innovators are moving so fluidly and I think audaciously between styles as to challenge the currency and accuracy of many generic distinctions, making modal boundaries more permeable than ever and sharing something of Zadie Smith's own determination to, quote, shake the novel, as she calls it, out of its present complacency. All of which makes the correlation between conceptions of identity and the craft of their articulation all the more necessary to discern. In what follows, let's take a cue from scholars like Saldiva, but also Colleen Lai, Rebecca Wolkowitz, and Dave Gunning, who's out there somewhere. These critics, I think, remind us of the need to mobilise the continuing importance of race as a category of analysis, not only beyond the potentially reductive premises of authorial nationality, ethnic origin, or affiliation, but also beyond the thematic horizons of ideology critique, to address instead newly racialised ethnicities in terms that can be related to the form and language of the literary text. If Smith is right to worry that even though fiction today can cut multiple roads, a breed of lyrical realism has had the freedom of the highway for some time now, with most other exits blocked, then one of my intentions here is to chart how writers have pursued alternative routes to seemingly localised destinations, yet without sacrificing their engagement with worldly concerns. For novelist Patrick Flannery, more and more of what we call American literature looks outward. Among his examples of this extraterritorial imperative is Jhumpa Lahiri, the London-born daughter of Bengali immigrants, who now lives in Rome, but whose New England regionalism, as Emila Seshagiri terms it, is perhaps her most significant achievement. Despite her fiction's apparently limited scale, it contains the consciousness of a nation. Whereas Seshagiri praises Lahiri's writing for giving us a portrait of an entire nation through its evocation of a single region, so Flannery sees her work as a natural response to the present moment in the evolution of the American literary canon. Wishes to say that there's a, quote, not a feeling not that American subjects have been exhausted, but there is both a challenge and possibility in turning to other countries as setting and subject of American novels, end quote. Viewed together, these reactions are in fact mutually complementary, each gesturing at how Lahiri uses the most singular of settings as optics for scrutinising the ordinary textures of first and generation immigrant life, registering the experiences within and beyond North America by tracing the emotional trials and compromises for Indian families moving between original and adopted nations. Lahiri's acclaimed collection, Unaccustomed Earth, exhibits this move between the regional and the global, devoted as several of the narratives are to characters who are literally or spiritually, quote, living antipodal lives under the same roof. In the title story, a widowed father becomes in retirement the unlikely transnational subject while visiting his daughter, Ruma. She accepts her conspicuous cultural and racial isolation in the Seattle suburbs, where although, quote, she was growing familiar with the roads, with the exits and the mountains and the quality of the light, she felt no connection to any of it or to anyone, end quote. Despite the fact that, quote, her mother's example, moving to a foreign place for the sake of marriage, caring exclusively for children and a household, has served as a warning path, a path to avoid, end quote. This was Ruma's life now. In turn, whereas in India there would be no question of his not moving in with her, Ruma's father makes travel plans to spend time in Europe with a new companion, confident in the knowledge that, quote, he did not want to live in the margins of his daughter's life in the shadow of her marriage. Different generations behaving toward each other or for themselves in unpredictable and uncustomary ways serves as one of Lahiri's strategies for localizing the tumult of ethnic unbelonging within the familial sphere. Concerned less with the overt clash of culture, religion, or race, Lahiri foregrounds the paradox, as Seshagiri describes it, that a nation like the US, founded on the notion of a hospitable soil, can only enrich that soil through a transient, uprooted citizenry. Elsewhere in Unaccustomed Earth, though, Lahiri fulfills more directly the kind of prediction Patrick Flannery makes about the worlding of American fiction's vision. For while Lahiri's New England settings do take on a kind of planetary breadth, achieving for that region, as Seshagiri puts it, a literary vividness equal to that of what Joyce achieved for Dublin, allowing readers to feel at home in places that alienate and discomfort her characters. That topographical vividness also reaches local places abroad, as the volume's final story showcases. Going Ashore brings to a tragic close a miniature trilogy of narratives that comprise the collection's second part. The first two offer a backstory through childhood of the growing relationship between Hema and Kaushik, whose brief, all-consuming romance occupies the concluding piece. Once in a Lifetime opens the trio as narrated by Hema, recounting the period when her parents opened their home to Kaushik's family when they returned from Bombay to Massachusetts. Victims of jet lag, Hema recalls, you belonged elsewhere. Hema's parents are perplexed by the ways in which they had changed, as though Bombay had made them more American than Cambridge had. Kaushik himself complicates his perception in the following story, Year's End, reflecting that, quote, I'd made the journey from India to Massachusetts, too old not to experience the shock of it, too young to have any say in the matter. By the time we re-encounter the couple in Rome and Going Ashore, Hema is on the verge of a wedding that's more determined than desired. Quote, she refused to think of it as an arranged marriage, but she knew in her heart that that's what it was. Kaushik has turned into an ambitious itinerant photographer who, quote, wanted to believe he was different, that in 10 minutes he could be on his way to anywhere in the world. Rome seems to make both characters acknowledge that it was impossible not to form attachments, however much their stay is temporary or fleeting in purpose. And regardless of the way that in Rome, in all of Europe, as Kaushik puts it, he was always regarded as an Indian first. For Hema, however, associations develop in spite of racial differences. Quote, certain elements of Rome, this is on your handout, I think, reminded her of Calcutta, the grand weathered buildings, the palm trees, the impossibility of crossing main streets. Much like the Calcutta Hema visited throughout her childhood, Rome was a city she knew on the one hand intimately, and on the other hand not at all, a place that fully absorbed her and also kept her at bay. Against the backdrop of this liminal environment, at once reminiscent and distancing, Lahiri emphasizes the precariousness and poignant transience of racial identification through the intimacy between two characters sharing comparable stories of immigration and integration. Indianness, in this context, is incidental, as Seshagiri points out. Its language and customs no more empowered to secure identity than the condition of parenthood or the experience of grief. And towards the denouement, it's a highly particularized landscape that is itself suffused with this grief when the couple travel north to Volterra, a town founded by the Etruscans. In this austere, forbidding and solitary place, they spend their final days together, the locale capturing the foreboding conclusiveness of their visit. This is the larger quote on your handout. They went in Kaushik's car up the coast to Tuscany, then cutting through the misted blue Maremma and the white chalk hills of the Cesena Valley, climbing and descending a thin slip of road. Volterra appeared in the distance, perched on a cliff high above the open countryside like an island surrounded by land. The rough, restrained architecture, the coats of arms and the hard, dark walls was something new for Hema. The medieval buildings were more recent than the Forum, yet Volterra felt more remote, impervious to tourists and time. Rome had hidden them, enabled them, their affair one of thousands, but here she felt singled out, exposed. She also sensed indifference. They were among a handful of people who seemed not to belong to Volterra, and she felt that the people who lived there were waiting for them politely but firmly to pass on. While race may have been incidental in Rome, in Volterra they had registered their difference once more through indifference, visibly marked as a touring minority who seemed not to belong. This provincial setting makes nomads of them both, its isolated beauty reaffirming the exposure Hema now senses afresh. Indeed, Lahiri's style encapsulates, as it contracts, something of this contrast between environment and affect, between the impervious elegance of Siena stone buildings and the brute reality of the couple's impermanence. Pictorially vivid renditions of the journey through misted blue and white chalk regions give way to the tightened syntax of Hema's intimations that their affair, like them, will pass on.